in the bustling city of Lagos, where the streets are always alive with music, laughter, and the scent of delicious food, there lives a young woman named Susan. Susan is 25 years old and comes from a very wealthy family. Her father, Richard, is a successful businessman who owns many companies, and they live in a grand mansion with tall gates and beautiful gardens. But Susan is not happy. She has always been close to her father, but 2 years ago, her mother passed away. Susan's heart was broken, and she felt like nothing could ever be the same again. Then, something happened that made her even more upset. Her father married another woman. This new woman, Sandra, became Susan's stepmother. Susan did not like Sandra from the moment she arrived. She felt like Sandra was trying to take her mother's place. Every time she saw Sandra, she remembered how her mother used to care for her, how they used to laugh together, and how much she missed her. Susan believed that no one could ever replace her mother, and so she started to dislike Sandra more and more. Even though Sandra tried to be kind and caring, Susan treated her coldly. She refused to speak to her unless she had to, and when she did, her words were sharp. She would order Sandra around, making her do all sorts of tasks that a maid would normally do. Sandra, clean my room. Sandra, bring me my breakfast. Sandra, wash my clothes, Susan would say, and even though Sandra was now the lady of the house, she did everything Susan asked, hoping that one day Susan would see her as family. But Susan didn't care. She wanted Sandra to feel as unwelcome as possible. She even started telling her friends how she had turned her stepmother into her maid, laughing at the thought. One day, after a long day at work, Richard noticed how tired Sandra looked. "My dear, you look exhausted," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" Sandra forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, everything is fine," she replied, not wanting to trouble him. But deep down, she was sad and tired. She wanted to tell him about how Susan was treating her, but she didn't want to cause any problems. Susan watched this from the corner of the room, feeling no pity for her stepmother. She deserves it, Susan thought. She has no right to be here. But little did Susan know, something was about to happen that would change everything. That night, after Richard had gone to bed, Susan sat in her room, scrolling through her phone. She was still thinking about how Sandra had looked so tired earlier. Instead of feeling bad, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She should just leave, Susan muttered to herself. Maybe then things can go back to the way they were. Suddenly, Susan heard a soft knock on her door. It was Sandra. "Susan, can I talk to you for a moment?" Sandra asked quietly. Susan rolled her eyes but nodded. "What is it?" she asked, not bothering to hide the annoyance in her voice. Sandra stepped into the room and sat down on the edge of Susan's bed. For a moment, she was silent, as if trying to find the right words. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Susan, I know you don't like me. I can see it in the way you look at me, in the way you speak to me, and I understand. I know it must be hard for you to have someone new in your life, especially after losing your mother, but I want you to know that I am not here to replace her. I could never do that." Susan listened but didn't say anything. Her heart felt a little heavy, but she pushed the feeling away. "I married your father because I love him," Sandra continued, "and because I care about you, too. I want us to be a family, Susan. I know it will take time, but I am willing to wait. All I ask is that you give me a chance." Susan felt a lump in her throat, but she quickly swallowed it. "You can say whatever you want," she replied coldly, "but nothing will change how I feel." Sandra sighed, a deep, sad sound that made Susan's chest tighten. "I see," Sandra said quietly, "but I will keep hoping, Susan. I will keep hoping that one day, you will see me not as an enemy, but as someone who cares about you." With that, Sandra stood up and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Susan sat there, staring at the door. She didn't like how she was feeling. It was as if a small part of her was starting to doubt everything she had thought about Sandra. But she quickly shook her head and decided to push those feelings away. Days passed, and Susan continued to treat Sandra harshly, but something strange started to happen. Sandra didn't seem as tired as before. In fact, she began to smile more. Even when Susan gave her difficult tasks, she would hum to herself as she cleaned or cooked. And she always had a kind word for the other staff in the house. Susan noticed this change, and it made her feel uneasy. Why is she still so cheerful? Susan wondered, isn't she upset that I treat her this way? One evening, Susan overheard a conversation between Sandra and one of the maids, Nkechi. They were in the kitchen, and Sandra was helping Nkechi prepare dinner. "Madam, why do you still do all this work when you don't have to?" Nkechi asked curiously. "You are the wife of the chief. You shouldn't be doing all these chores." Sandra smiled warmly at Nkechi. "I do it because it makes me happy," she replied. "When I help out, I feel like I am part of this family, like I am contributing something. And who knows, maybe one day, Susan will see that I truly care." Nkechi nodded, though she still looked puzzled. "You are a good woman, madam. I hope Miss Susan sees that soon." Susan quickly left before they could see her. She felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was angry that Sandra was still being so kind, even after everything. But another part of her, a very small part, felt something different. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Could it be guilt? Susan tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow. She became more withdrawn, spending most of her time in her room or out with her friends. She avoided Sandra as much as possible. But even then, she couldn't ignore the small changes happening in the house. The staff seemed happier, the atmosphere lighter, and even her father, Richard, seemed more at peace. One afternoon, while Susan was in her room scrolling through her phone, she heard a soft knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Sandra, it was one of the maids. "Miss Susan," the maid said nervously. "Madam Sandra is not feeling well. She fainted in the garden, and we've taken her to her room. Chief is not home, and we don't know what to do." Susan's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she didn't know what to say or do. But then, without thinking, she jumped up and hurried to Sandra's room. When she arrived, she found Sandra lying on the bed, looking pale and weak. The sight of her stepmother in such a vulnerable state made Susan's heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. All the anger and resentment she had been holding onto suddenly seemed so small and pointless. "Susan," Sandra whispered when she saw her standing in the doorway. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you." "Don't talk," Susan said quickly, her voice shaking. "Just stressed. I'll call a doctor." Susan grabbed her phone and dialed the family doctor's number, her hands trembling. As she waited for the doctor to arrive, she stayed by Sandra's side, holding her hand. For the first time, Susan allowed herself to really see Sandra not as an enemy, but as a person who was trying her best to be part of their family. When the doctor finally arrived, he examined Sandra and gave her some medicine. "She's just exhausted," the doctor said kindly. "She needs to rest and avoid stress. Make sure she eats well and gets plenty of sleep." Susan nodded, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. She realized that she was part of the reason Sandra was so tired. All the chores, the cold treatment, the harsh words, it had all taken a toll on her stepmother. As the doctor left, Susan sat quietly beside Sandra, who had fallen asleep. She looked at Sandra's peaceful face and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered, though she knew Sandra couldn't hear her. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The next morning, Susan woke up early. She decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. She went to the kitchen and started preparing breakfast. The maids were surprised to see her cooking, but Susan waved them away, determined to do it herself. When the food was ready, Susan carefully carried the tray to Sandra's room. She knocked softly before entering. Sandra was awake, sitting up in bed. She looked surprised when she saw Susan with the tray of food. "I made you breakfast," Susan said quietly, setting the tray down on the bedside table. "The doctor said you need to eat well." Sandra smiled, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Susan," she said softly. "This means a lot to me." Susan didn't know what to say. She just nodded and sat down on the edge of the bed, watching as Sandra started to eat. As she sat there, Susan realized that something had changed. The anger she had been holding onto for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something new, something that felt a lot like hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe she could find a way to let go of the past and start building a new future with Sandro and her father. But Susan knew it wouldn't be easy. There was still a lot to work through, and she wasn't sure where to begin. But for the first time in a long time, Susan felt like she was ready to try. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she didn't want to be alone anymore. She wanted to be part of a family again, even if it meant opening her heart to someone she had once seen as an enemy. And so, with a deep breath, Susan decided that she would try. It was the first step on a new journey, one that would take time and patience, but Susan was ready to see where it would lead. As the days passed, Susan found herself slowly adjusting to this new, unfamiliar feeling, one of connection rather than distance. She started spending more time with Sandra, helping her with small tasks around the house, and even joining her for tea in the afternoons. It was awkward at first, and sometimes they sat in silence, unsure of what to say. But gradually, the silence began to fill with conversation, and the awkwardness started to melt away. One afternoon, Susan and Sandra were sitting in the garden when the flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of jasmine. The sun was warm on their faces, and for once, Susan felt a sense of peace. "Susan," Sandra said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking. I know I can never replace your mother, and I don't want to, but I do want to find a way for us to be close, in our own way." Susan looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the teacup she was holding. "I know," she replied quietly. "I've been thinking too, about how I've treated you." Sandra reached out and gently touched Susan's hand. "You were hurting, Susan. I understand that, but I'm glad we're talking now. That's what matters." Susan nodded, feeling the warmth of Sandra's hand in hers. "I'm sorry for everything," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so angry. I didn't want to lose my father, and I felt like I was losing him when he married you." "You haven't lost him," Sandra said softly. "He loves you very much, Susan. He talks about you all the time, how proud he is of the woman you've become." Susan felt a lump in her throat. "I was just scared," she admitted. "I didn't want to let anyone else in. I thought it would mean forgetting my mother." Sandra shook her head gently. "Your mother will always be a part of you, Susan. No one can ever take that away. But it's okay to let others in too. It doesn't mean you'll love her any less." Susan took a deep breath, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside her. "I want to try," she said finally. "I want to try to be a family with you and Dad. I don't know how to start, but I'm willing to learn." Sandra smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. "That's all I've ever wanted, Susan. We'll take it one step at a time, together." From that day on, Susan made a conscious effort to be more open with Sandra. She started to share more about her life, her hopes, her dreams, even her fears. And in return, Sandra shared stories from her own past. Stories that made Susan see her stepmother in a new light. One evening, after dinner, Susan found herself in the living room with her father and Sandra. Richard was reading the newspaper, and Sandra was knitting a scarf. Susan sat down next to her father and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Dad," she said softly, "I've been thinking. I want us to do more things together. As a family." Richard looked at her with surprise. Then a smile spread across his face. "I would love that, Susan," he said, wrapping an arm around her. "What did you have in mind?" Susan thought for a moment. "Maybe we could take a trip together, just the three of us, somewhere quiet, where we can relax and spend time together." "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Sandra chimed in, looking up from her knitting. "I know a place by the coast, where the beaches are beautiful and the sunsets are even better." Susan smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. "That sounds perfect," she said. And so, they began planning their trip, a trip that Susan hoped would be the start of something new, something beautiful. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be challenges along the way, but Susan was ready to face them. As the evening wore on, Susan looked around the room, at her father and her stepmother, and felt a sense of belonging. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of a family again, a family that she was starting to love in her own way. But Susan didn't know that this trip would bring unexpected surprises, and that the journey they were about to embark on would change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. A few weeks later, the day of the trip arrived. The sun was shining brightly as Susan, Richard, and Sandra packed their bags into the family's sleek black SUV. The coastal town they were headed to was a few hours away, and Susan couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. This trip felt like a new beginning, but she also knew that spending so much time together would be different, maybe even difficult. As they drove out of Lagos, leaving behind the city's hustle and bustle, Susan gazed out the window, watching the scenery change from tall buildings to lush greenery and open fields. The car was filled with the sound of soft music, and for a while, no one spoke. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, as if they were all gathering their thoughts for the days ahead. After a few hours, they arrived at the coastal town. It was a quiet, picturesque place with white sandy beaches, palm trees swaying in the breeze, and colorful boats bobbing on the gentle waves. The air smelled of salt, and the distant sound of seagulls echoed through the air. Their accommodation was a beautiful beachfront cottage with large windows overlooking the ocean. As they settled in, Susan felt a sense of calm wash over her. The cottage was cozy and inviting, with soft, colorful fabrics and wooden furniture that made it feel like home. "This place is lovely," Susan said, smiling as she stepped onto the veranda that overlooked the beach. The view was breathtaking, endless blue sea stretching out to the horizon, the sun casting a golden glow on the water. "I'm glad you like it," Sandra replied, joining her on the veranda. "I used to come here with my family when I was younger. It's always been a special place for me." Susan glanced at Sandra, noticing the softness in her voice. "Thank you for bringing us here," she said sincerely. "It feels nice." Sandra smiled warmly. "I'm happy we're here together." That evening, after they had unpacked and rested from the journey, the three of them decided to take a walk along the beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of pink, orange and purple. The water was cool as it lapped at their feet, and the sand was soft beneath their toes. As they walked, Richard shared stories from his childhood, making Susan and Sandra laugh with tales of his mischievous adventures. Susan felt a sense of closeness she hadn't felt in a long time. The barriers she had built around her heart seemed to be crumbling bit by bit. When they returned to the cottage, Susan and Sandra worked together to prepare dinner. It was a simple meal: grilled fish, fresh vegetables, and rice, but it was delicious, and the atmosphere at the dinner table was warm and relaxed. After dinner, they sat outside on the veranda, listening to the sound of the waves and watching the stars appear in the night sky. Susan felt a deep sense of contentment as she leaned back in her chair, gazing up at the stars. "Do you ever think about what's out there?" Susan asked, her voice soft in the quiet night. Richard chuckled. "I've always been curious about the stars. When I was a boy, I used to lie on the roof of our house and try to count them." "I used to do the same," Sandra added with a smile. "It always made me feel small, but in a good way, like there was so much more to the world than I could see." Susan nodded, feeling a sense of wonder as she looked up at the twinkling lights in the sky. "It makes me think that maybe our problems aren't as big as they seem," she said quietly. "There's so much more to life." Sandra reached out and took Susan's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're right, Susan. There's so much more to life, and I'm glad we're here, experiencing it together." For the first time, Susan didn't pull away from Sandra's touch. Instead, she held on, feeling a connection that was beginning to grow stronger with each passing day. As the night grew darker, they all retired to their rooms, tired but content. Susan lay in bed, listening to the soothing sound of the waves. She felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time, and for once, she wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. The next few days were filled with more moments of laughter, exploration, and bonding. They visited the local markets, went on boat rides, and even tried their hand at fishing. Susan found herself enjoying Sandra's company more and more. The resentment she once felt was slowly being replaced by something she had never expected: affection. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, something unexpected happened. On the last day of their trip, as they were packing up to leave, Susan received a phone call from her best friend, Kemi. Susan answered the call with a smile, but as she listened to Kemi's frantic voice on the other end of the line, her expression changed. "What do you mean? You saw him?" Susan asked, her voice rising in concern. "Are you sure?" Kemi's voice was trembling as she replied. "Susan, I'm sure. I saw him in town. Your father's old business partner, Mr. Adwale, the one who disappeared after that scandal years ago. He was talking to some men. It didn't look good." Susan felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Adwale had been a close friend of her father's until he got involved in some shady deals and disappeared without a trace. It had nearly ruined Richard's business and left a cloud of suspicion over their family. "Where did you see him?" Susan asked urgently. "In Lagos, near the old warehouse by the docks," Kemi replied. "I thought you should know." Susan's mind raced. What could Mr. Adwale be doing back in town, and why now, just as things were finally getting better? As she hung up the phone, Susan's heart pounded with a mix of fear and uncertainty. She knew she had to tell her father, but she wasn't sure how he would react, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something much bigger, a storm that could turn their lives upside down once again. Susan's heart raced as she stood there, phone in hand, trying to make sense of the news. Mr. Adwale's sudden reappearance could mean trouble. and the thought of anything threatening the fragile peace her family had finally found was terrifying. She took a deep breath and walked into the living room, where Richard and Sandra were finishing up their packing. Her father looked up and immediately noticed the worry on her face. "Susan, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Susan hesitated for a moment, then decided she had to be honest. "Dad, I just got a call from Kemi. She said she saw Mr. Adwale in Lagos, near the old warehouse by the docks." Richard's face tightened, and he set down the suitcase he was holding. "Adwale," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Are you sure?" Susan nodded. "Kemi said she's sure. She saw him talking to some men. It didn't look good." Richard's expression darkened. Mr. Adwale had been like a brother to him before the scandal, but his betrayal had nearly destroyed the family's reputation and business. The news of his return was unsettling, to say the least. "What do you think he's up to?" Sandra asked quietly, stepping closer to her husband. "I don't know," Richard replied, his voice heavy with worry. "But whatever it is, it can't be good. I'll have to look into this as soon as we get back to Lagos." The drive back to the city was tense. The lightheartedness of the past few days had vanished, replaced by a sense of dread. Susan sat in the back seat, staring out the window, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Adwale's return was more than just a coincidence. By the time they reached Lagos, the sun had set, casting long shadows over the city. As they pulled into the driveway of their mansion, Richard turned to Susan and Sandra. "I need to make some calls," he said. "We need to be careful, but we'll get through this, just like we've gotten through everything else." Susan nodded, though she couldn't help but feel uneasy. As her father disappeared into his study, Susan and Sandra made their way inside. The house felt different now, less like a refuge, and more like a place where danger might be lurking around the corner. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Richard had made some calls and learned that Mr. Adwale had been seen around town, meeting with various unsavory characters. It was clear that he was up to something, but what exactly remained a mystery. "We'll have to keep our guard up," Richard said as they ate. "I'll meet with the board tomorrow and put some security measures in place. We can't let him catch us off guard." Susan nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly their lives had changed just when things were starting to get better. She felt a deep sense of frustration. Why couldn't they just have peace? As the days passed, Susan tried to focus on her usual routine, but it was difficult. The tension in the house was growing, and she could see the stress taking a toll on her father. Sandra did her best to keep things running smoothly, but even she seemed more reserved than usual. One evening, as Susan sat in the living room, flipping through a book without really reading it, Sandra came in and sat down beside her. "Susan," she began gently, "I know this situation with Mr. Adwale is worrying you. It's worrying all of us, but we need to stay strong and united." Susan sighed, closing the book and looking at her stepmother. "I just don't understand why this is happening now. We were finally starting to feel like a family, and now this." Sandra reached out and took Susan's hand. "Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it, but I believe that we can get through this together. We've come so far already, haven't we?" Susan nodded slowly. "We have. I just don't want anything to ruin it." Sandra squeezed her hand. "We won't let it. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." The days turned into weeks, and though they kept a watchful eye on Mr. Adwale's movements, nothing drastic happened. It seemed he was more interested in making connections with shady business partners than directly targeting the family. But one afternoon, When Susan was out running errands, she received a call from her father. His voice was calm but firm. "Susan, I need you to come to the office," Richard said. "There's something you need to see." When Susan arrived at her father's office, she found him and Sandry sitting with a man she didn't recognize. He introduced himself as Mr. Okoye, a private investigator her father had hired to look into Mr. Adwale's activities. Mr. Okoye explained that they had discovered Mr. Adwale's real motive. He had been secretly gathering evidence to expose some corrupt officials involved in the scandal that had tarnished Richard's business years ago. Mr. Adwale was planning to clear his name by bringing them down. "He's not after you," Mr. Okoye concluded. "He's after the people who used him as a scapegoat." Susan was stunned. "So he's not trying to hurt us?" "No," Richard replied. "In fact, he might be the key to finally putting this chapter behind us." In the following days, Richard reached out to Mr. Adwale. Their meeting was tense but necessary. They agreed to work together to expose the corrupt officials, using the evidence Mr. Adwale had collected. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to ensure the safety and integrity of the family and the business. Months later, after a lengthy legal battle, the truth finally came to light. The corrupt officials were brought to justice, and Mr. Adwale's name was cleared. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy Richard's business was now behind them, and the family could finally move on. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Susan looked around at her father and Sandra. The tension that had once filled their lives was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and contentment. "We made it through," Susan said softly, smiling at them. "We did," Richard agreed, reaching out to hold their hands. Sandra looked at Susan with a warmth that only deepened their bond. "And we did it together. As a family." Susan felt a surge of emotion as she looked at them. She had spent so long resisting the idea of a new family, but now she couldn't imagine her life without them. They had faced challenges, but they had also found strength in each other. As they sat there, the sun setting outside the window, Susan realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead. But now she knew that they could face anything together. For the first time in a long time, Susan felt truly at peace, surrounded by the love and support of her family, a family she had come to cherish. And so, as the night fell, Susan knew that no matter what the future held, she was no longer alone. She had a family she could count on, and that made all the difference.